This section includes how to reduce toxicity. What are the processes you're going to go through to reduce toxicity? Part of that process is this thing called TIEs, Toxicity Identification Evaluation. So what I'm going to do is kind of go over EPA's overall guidance on the approach for TREs and then talk a little bit about TIEs. The TRE is a site-specific study conducted in a stepwise process so that you can first identify what's causing toxicity, then hopefully isolate it and remove it, and then evaluate your removal process and then confirm that you eliminated toxicity consistently. So that's sort of what the steps that we're trying to take here. This is straight out of the EPA's guidance documents, but basically what you have in your permit is you have permit monitoring. So you're doing your toxicity monitoring, and within your permit you have some exceedance language, right? And so the discharger is allowed a certain number of toxicity hits, but if they exceed it too often, then they have to go into accelerated testing. And the whole idea here is in your permits you have this part is designed or is predefined. Your frequency for accelerated testing is in the permit, right? And then you're allowed, when you do that, you want to see if you've got a consistent toxicity signal. You test it again, a certain number of times, it's not toxic, then you just go back to regular monitoring. But if you repeat it and you have a certain number of defined failures, then you're going to, you say, yes, it's toxic again, it's consistently toxic, so we have to do a TRE. We have to reduce toxicity to eliminate it so you're back within compliance. So in terms of responsibilities of the permitting authority, this is the other thing to try to emphasize is this idea of not trying to guess what's causing toxicity. I think in some cases it might be obvious. For the most part, in our experience, it's never been obvious. Even when we're working in places where we know we have specific pesticides running off of fields, it's not always obvious. So that's why they're trying to emphasize this idea of not playing hunches. And so that's the idea of having a work plan in place, which is detailed with who's responsible for the process, what the communication is going to be, who's going to communicate with who, how often, and milestones with a schedule. And so I'm going to be a little bit redundant about this idea of a reasonable compliance schedule, because you don't want anybody wasting time, because time is money. That's the idea. So in the work plan, you assume it's going to be technically credible, contain a reasonable schedule, and this is probably one of the most important parts, have experienced personnel and laboratory personnel. So, but in terms of elements of your work plan, you say who's going to do what, that's predefined. You have a complete list of the data types that you're going to review. Again, schedule and list of the reporting requirements, and then the outlines of who's responsible for what. So these are the steps to consider: your information and data acquisition, your facility performance evaluation. I'm presuming that that's related to the engineers who are going to be involved in the process. Toxicity identification evaluation I'm going to talk about in a second as we proceed. And then finally, once you've identified what's toxic, you have a control procedure in place, and you want to evaluate how well that control procedure is working. And then you implemented that control and follow-up monitoring. Now, a subcomponent of a TRE is this TIE, which is a toxicity identification evaluation. And EPA says it's not required in performing a TIE. I really can't think of many instances where it wouldn't be required, but there might be cases where there's, something obvious. Somebody's kicked over a jar of tetrachlorokilomol and it's gone into your waste stream. I think for the most part, you're gonna be required to do this TIE because it's not going to be an obvious source of toxicity. And so a TIE is specified in EPA's documents, and they're for both freshwater and marine, aquatic samples and sediment. They have all these guidance documents for TIE procedures, and plus there's a whole body of literature surrounding these, and these are all available. They're divided into 3 phases, and the phases are characterization, identification, and confirmation. Sometimes they're interchangeable. Sometimes characterization and identification are included in the same same experiments, but I'll lay out what those are. Basically what you're trying to do is, it's a series of forensic experiments where you're trying to manipulate the sample to either, mostly to decrease toxicity, but sometimes increase toxicity. And you combine that manipulation with some chemical evidence to give you an idea of what's causing toxicity. That's it in a nutshell. It's sleuthing. It's applicable to effluents, ambient waters, and sediments, and we probably have more experience in these, especially ambient waters. I'll give you one example of that. Okay, so this is the phase 1 flow chart that's produced in the EPA guidance document. And so phase 1 is characterization. Basically what that means is we're trying to differentiate between ammonia, in some case hydrogen sulfide, metals, and organic constituents. So those are the sort of 3 classes of contaminants that the characterization process is dealing with. And again, when we're talking about a sample here, we're talking about an aqueous sample, usually effluent and ambient water or pore water extracted from sediment. And so this very top box up here is the baseline sample. And so that's your sample that's toxic, that's unmanipulated. And what you're doing is all these manipulations of the sample to try to see if you've either usually eliminated toxicity, sometimes increased toxicity, and you take that information, you add it to your chemical characterization of the sample, and you compare it back to your baseline sample to see if that's a piece of evidence that's pointing at a specific class of either metal, organic, or ammonia. So it shows you here pH manipulations, EDTA addition. So EDTA is a cation binder. Zeolite is for ammonia. So EDTA and sodium thiosulfate both affect metals. These two are more affect ammonia. Filtration is another way to get at metals or particulate cause toxicity. And these are other chemical classes. I would say these ones we use less. Some of these we use more than others.
The pHs are more for like the industrial chemicals and volatile chemicals, like things that if you could like lower a sample down to pH 3 and it'll blow off the contaminant, and you raise it back to ambient for testing and that contaminant's been removed. It's more for industrial processes.
It also plays a role with ammonia.
Yeah.
Okay, characterization. Is it a metal? Is it ammonia? Is it an organic? We don't have sulfide on this list, but sulfide plays a big role in sediments, obviously, so we include that in sediment TIEs. And again, we have the same sort of database where we know the effect level for sulfide for most of our test organisms. That's sort of predefined. A lot of times what will happen is you'll have a mixture. We've seen this before where we have a sample. I can think of San Francisco Bay, right there at China Basin where the ballpark is. There's a combined sewage discharge that leads into that channel right there. And it's loaded with organic matter from from stormwater discharges. It's really high in ammonia, but it also has organic contaminants in that sample too. So the first thing we have to do is blow off the ammonia through aeration or through manipulating the pH to eliminate that as a toxicant, and then we can do TIEs on what's left over, the organic constituents. And that happens quite often, especially in sediment TIEs, because the samples are so complicated. They have such complicated mixtures of contaminants in them. The examples I'm going to give you are a lot simpler than that, though. Then I just put some examples of some solid phase extraction columns. These are, there's a couple of different types, but one that's used commonly are these Oasis HLB columns, and those are just columns that are loaded with resins that bind organic chemicals. And these are the same columns that the chemists use for solid phase extraction of water samples to do chemistry on them. So the idea here is, with a toxicity test, if you pass a sample through that solid phase extraction column, you test that effluent that comes out the other side, and it's not toxic. That's a line of evidence that it's an organic constituent that's causing toxicity. That's a phase 1 step. A phase 2 step is you take whatever was on that column, whatever stuck to that resin, you elute it with something like methanol, some organic solvent. You spike it back into water and you return toxicity. Then you know it was some organic chemical that was trapped on that resin that you could recover with the solvent. And then the idea here is you do the same thing on the chemistry end of it, and you see what was trapped on that column and what was returned. And so that's basically a combination phase 1, phase 2 test. And one of the examples I'm going to show you is exactly that. And over here this is another resin type. This is a cation exchange resin that binds things like copper ions or zinc ions. So it's the same thing. Can we trap a sample on this, remove toxicity, elute it with an acid, spike it back in water, and return toxicity? That's indicative of some metal. Sometimes we'll combine these columns we'll do them in a series if we have a combination of, if we suspect it's metals and organics in the same sample. One thing about TIEs is, I think dischargers are shocked at how much it costs to do them, because it's a lot of laboratory time and it's a lot of chemistry time. And so it's not a trivial process, for somebody that's out of compliance and has to go to this process. It's not trivial. Okay, so phase 1 was characterization. Phase 2 is identification. So phase 1 was, is it ammonia? Is it a metal? Is it an organic? Phase 2 is, what's the specific chemical causing toxicity? So you have a whole bunch of different steps to it. Filterable toxicants, solid phase extraction with elution, graduated pH Z-light or air stripping for ammonia, these different column types. And then there's also these solid phase extraction resins that do the same thing. They bind cation metals. Sodium thiosulfate also will make certain cationic metals unbioavailable, so it binds with them. And then graduated pH will also affect metal bioavailability. We have no experience in our laboratory with surfactants, but in certain cases, there are industrial discharges that have soaps associated with them. So these steps are part of that process. Same thing with certain manufacturing that have dyes associated with them. So there are TIE steps for those types of constituents. And then the final step is confirmation. So you think you've identified the specific source of toxicity, and you have to confirm it so that you're not doing a TRE on the wrong chemical. That's what the confirmation step is. These are spelled out, and this is basically a separate book produced by EPA for phase 3 confirmation steps. Some of it involves sample spiking. We were talking about spiking back the specific chemical that you think you've identified to see if that concentration is having the same effect that you saw in your sample. We compare different species sensitivities. Sometimes we'll do that. We were talking earlier about how Cereodaphnia and Coronimus and Hyalella all have different sensitivities to different pesticides. So we can use that information as a TIE procedure as well. Correlation analysis is just correlating the chemical concentrations with the effect. Sometimes certain chemicals, neurotoxins, have specific symptoms. There's industrial chemicals that cause like coughing in fish. So these can all be used as confirmation steps. And then we're getting back to your role, and this is EPA guidance. Basically what this means is, if you have a consulting laboratory working with your permittee, they're basically saying there should be allowance for letting the consulting lab be creative if they're not wasting time. If it makes sense scientifically, if it makes sense chemically what they're doing, then great, that can be supported. You just don't want somebody dithering, basically, is what it comes down to. But there have been cases where, especially in effluent discharges where there's transient toxicity, and sometimes this happens like in ambient samples where toxicity will appear and disappear and will appear and disappear, and people have spent lots of money going after that signal, trying to figure out what's causing toxicity. but can never get at it. There are guidance documents within EPA that sort of assist you if you're in that situation. It's a little bit of a gray area, so there's no bright line there on how much money or how much effort you have to put this issue to rest, but EPA does recognize that happens, and so they do provide some guidance on that. Hopefully you guys won't have to go there. Yeah, so you're just trying to make the process move along as quickly as possible so you can get to the point where you can eliminate toxicity. So I have two examples that actually involve TIEs. So the first example is straight out of a TIE, TRE book. So this is a secondary municipal wastewater treatment plant. Remember I told you that you can test interchangeably with these two different echinoderms, the dendraster, the sand dollar, and the purple sea urchin, depending on their seasonal availability. I think this is the fertilization endpoint with these two species. They exceeded their monthly limit. Ammonia was in the effluent, but they knew it was less than the toxicity threshold, so they didn't have to do TIEs for ammonia. And basically, they were directed to go through the TRE process and started that with a TIE. And so these are two separate TIEs. So you have over here the treatments, pH 3, and basically what that is taking that sample that was probably at neutral pH around 8 or so, taking it down to 3, and then bringing it back up and testing it. The same thing with pH 11, is raising it back up and then bringing it down and testing it. Filtration for particles, aeration for volatiles or ammonia, EDTA for chelating divalent cations. Sodium thiosulfate also affects certain metals. It's also there for chlorine. That's one of the reasons for adding sodium thiosulfate. And these are that C18 column, which is a column for sulfase extracting column for eliminating organics, and then eluting the column to see if you can determine. So the thing to look at here, the thing that worked on both separate TIEs was this part, this EDTA and sodium thiosulfate. Both of those were consistent in eliminating toxicity. There's a little bit of noise in the other data here. The pH had an effect one time, but not the other. The high pH and the low pH had an effect, sort of an inconsistent effect. But this is the thing that you're really looking at, combined with the fact that these organic manipulations had really no effect. So this is sort of a key piece of evidence that you'd be looking at. And whoever the consulting lab was that was working on that, we actually know the consulting lab that was working on this. This is what they glommed onto was these metal evidence. So the idea there is to go back and say, okay, based on that, EDTA binds a certain number of different chemicals, or different divalent cations. Which ones are in this effluent that are at a concentration that could possibly cause toxicity? So that's the idea here, is combining it with the chemistry. And so these are the concentrations measured in the effluent, cadmium, copper, and mercury. We know from most of the protocols we've done dose response work, either because there's been previous testing with those metals, or because of reference toxicity testing. We know what the effect range is for these three different chemicals. And so the one that really stands out in this case is copper. Its concentration exceeds the NOAC for that particular constituent, for that particular metal. So that's basically it in a nutshell. It's the likely cause based on these two lines of evidence is copper. I didn't include the phase 3 results here in this example because I didn't want to overwhelm you guys, but they did take that effluent and add copper to it to demonstrate that the level of copper that they added to it was, that they manipulated how much they could remove with the EDTA. It increased toxicity, so that was another line of evidence that copper was the specific cation that was causing toxicity. And that's what they went after in the effluent and eliminated it. Then the second example is, this is organophosphate pesticides. And I included this example because I wanted to add what we're doing on TREs for pesticides on the Central Coast. So this is a couple of different ag discharges that go into the lower Santa Maria River on the Central Coast. So these are a bunch of different ag drainages that go into Orcutt Creek and Solomon Creek, which drain into the Santa Maria River right at the lower river. And we did a bunch of testing with Cereodaphnia and Hyla. I'm just going to show you the Cereodaphnia results. This was all of this led into a TMDL for pesticides in the lower Santa Maria River. So, and what that's doing is that TMDL for pesticides in general is forcing growers in that area to address sources of these pesticides, so they're starting to implement management practices to reduce these pesticides. That's sort of where all this work is led. So I'm just showing you the TIE results here. So it's Solomon Creek is the creek that's draining into the river, and then these are samples from the river itself. And again, remember I said baseline samples are the unmanipulated samples. I'm just trying to see how toxic they are. So in this case, it's 8 toxic units, and what that's based on is a dilution series of that Solomon Creek sample. We did a dilution series to see the magnitude of toxicity in that sample, and the magnitude is it adds up to 8 toxic units. Toxic unit in this case is defined as the concentration that caused 50% mortality of Cereodaphnia dubia. So it's got 8 times that amount in the sample when you unmanipulate it. You do the chemistry on that. We measured a whole bunch of different chemical constituents, and I'm just kind of including the ones that, the one chemical that was sort of indicated as a smoking gun was chlorpyrifos in this example. So we did that in Solomon Creek, and then we went in the river itself and looked at did the same sort of manipulations, and again, it was chlorpyrifos. I've had other people ask me, well, why don't you have metal results up here or other pesticides? And we did measure all those constituents, but we know in these ag drains where you have just, it's furrow runoff from irrigated row crop operations, you don't really have metals in those samples. So you can measure it once and show that all of our metal concentrations are way below any effect level for Cereodaphnia dubia. So we don't need to waste our money doing that every time in this case, because it ends up just being a waste of money. So that's basically, and I said here, sometimes in TIEs, like Bryn's right, these are abbreviated TIEs, and we're combining phase 1 and phase 2 steps, you know, just for expediency, because it's more efficient to do that. So in this case, solid phase extraction, with this was an OASIS column, that's classically called a phase 1 characterization step. This elution of that column and spiking it back into water to see if we can, you know, here we're completely eliminated the toxic units and then we've added them all back. This is phase 1 and this is a phase 2 step. You can also see that this is the chlorpyrifos concentration in our baseline sample. It's it's 2,500 nanograms per liter. The LC50 for chlorpyrifos for this animal is 5350 or so nanograms per liter. So we know we've got a lot in there relative to a known LC50. It also shows you that it's not always straight. The math is not always straight, because this says 8 toxic units. Based on this concentration and what we know about the LC50, really we would say if it was 50 and this is 2,500, it'd be a lot more than 8, wouldn't it?
But keep in mind that the eight toxic unit for that TU column was calculated based on
a dilution series of the sample.
Series of the sample and percentages of the sample. But then that can, if you do that properly, you can make a comparison to the actual chemical toxic units that are in that sample. But if you have all of your dilution all the way up to 100% is hammered and everything's dead, then you can only kill things once.
Yeah.
So you can have 2 toxic units of chlorpyrifos and everything's dead. So everything above that is gravy. It's just you're going to kill things over and over again. It's like having too many nuclear bombs.
Yeah. So thanks for pointing out. That's why these numbers don't always add up.
Yeah.
Exactly.
because we did a dilution series that was like 150, 25, 0, you know, like again, an abbreviated 3 concentration. Instead of 5 concentrations, we had 3 concentrations in a control. And then, so we just did the math on that, and I think it came out to 8, you know, because that's how the LC50 from those stats was created.
These steps here are all designed for pyrethroids. Actually, PBO can also be a TIE step for organophosphates, but we use it a lot for pyrethroids because when you add this chemical, it can increase toxicity. This enzyme is derived from a pig liver, and it breaks down pyrethroid pesticides, so it's another line of evidence for a pyrethroid. Basically, what this came down to, though, is pointing at chlorpyrifos. And so what I wanted to talk about a little bit is what we've been doing for the TRE part of this on the Central Coast. And it isn't only for chlorpyrifos, but it's for just mixtures of pesticides in general. And for ag dischargers, what we're trying to do is come up with a TRE step that will eliminate pesticides from their runoff. And so that's what these systems are. They're vegetative treatment systems that are basically filtering pesticides out. And so they combine, 3 different steps basically. I don't have the first step, which is a sedimentation pond that's supposed to designed to strip out all the suspended particles first, and then we're running water through these grass-lined ditches. We have a whole bunch of different kinds of plants we use, but usually it's some kind of fescue in a grass-lined ditch, or it's something like pennywort in a pond. And then we finally have a step that's a polishing step. In this case, it's a granulated activated carbon that works to everything that isn't eliminated by the sedimentation pond or doesn't get stuck to this grass or drop out in this grass-lined ditch. We clean it up with activated carbon. So that's the TRE part of this process. We're spending a lot of time right now working with DPR, trying to fine-tune these systems and then trying to implement them throughout the Central Coast. So that's the TRE aspect of the ag discharge. So I've got an example here of some data on an experimental farm where we spiked chlorpyrifos into water. We ran it through these treatment systems, and then we were looking at removal of chlorpyrifos and comparing that to toxicity results. So we have flow rates at a couple of different flow rates, 3.2 liters per minute and 6.3 liters per minute. And basically what we're doing is we're comparing the inlet concentrations of chlorpyrifos to the outlet concentrations, measuring chlorpyrifos with ELISA at 2 different flow rates. And then these are different trials of these spiking experiments. And the main thing to look at down here is this overall load reduction that we're getting. So this is a combination of how much of the pesticide we're stripping out in the grass and the sedimentation with the carbon, and then combined with infiltration, we're getting like 98% removal of chlorpyrifos in these systems. And so 98% reduction is pretty good, but you can see this is the toxicity results with Ceredaphnia, and these are survival. So we've removed toxicity on these 2 trials, but not on this one. There was enough chlorpyrifos in that outlet that we still killed all the animals. So what we're trying to get down to here is no toxicity. So you can see it works sometimes at this lower flow rate, but it doesn't work all the time. So that's what we're working on now, is trying to perfect that so we can eliminate toxicity, especially at higher flow rates. We use chlorpyrifos in this example because even though it's not used as much in agriculture these days, it still is used in certain applications, and it's one of those pesticides that's kind of moderately soluble. So the ones that are sticky, that are really hydrophobic, like pyrethroids, are the ones that are the easiest ones to remove. Chlorpyrifos is sort of in the intermediate range, so it's not the easiest one to remove. So it provides a good example for testing one of these systems. The newer classes, the neonicotinoids, which we're seeing, I'd say 80% of our samples now on the Central Coast have imidacloprid in them. That's that class is the hardest class to remove from discharges because they're so soluble. It's almost as soluble as nitrate. So we're just at the process now of testing these systems with imidacloprid to see how well we can remove it. We're starting out with just laboratory tests. I just put this picture because we just got some funding to work with biochar as a alternative to granulated activated carbon. And we're hoping to use this because the problem with this material is you gotta buy it, and then once it gets loaded up with pesticides, you have to take it off to a hazardous waste dump, so you gotta pay money for that. And growers are gonna be less inclined to do that than to work with something they can plow back in the field, and that's what we're hoping we can do with biochar. So we're in the middle of doing some trials now with chlorpyrifos and imidacloprid to see how well these two compare. And hopefully we're gonna be able to use this in our system as time goes on. And so the thing to remember too is we're using these carbon sources at the end of these systems because this stuff it's not cheap. This is, the cheapest form of this is $1 a pound, and we're probably using 500 pounds a season, you know, on a particular field. So we want to use these at the very end of these treatment systems so that they have the most binding capacity possible. So we're trying to get rid of stuff through that sedimentation section and through the grassline ditch. I don't think those work at all for imidacloprid, so that's why we're going to have some sort of carbon polishing step for that class of pesticide.